welcome to the evokeAG podcast, the show where we take a look at the ag tech and food innovations changing the future of farming. Hello and welcome to the evokeAG podcast. I'm your host, Steve Honner. This week, we had a fascinating and insightful chat with food futurist Tony Hunter. Tony has had a long and an extensive career in the food industry and has seen a lot of change along the way. He runs his own consulting business and specialises in focusing on the new and emerging trends and predicting how they might impact current food businesses. We had a wide-ranging chat around many different topics, ranging from cellular meats, insects, smoked salmon made from algae, whiskey, and producing human milk using cells. Tony gives us some amazing insights and a glimpse of what food might look like into the future. So without further delay, please sit back and enjoy this discussion. Hi Tony, thanks for joining the evokeAG podcast. Can you tell our listeners what are some of the consumer trends that you're seeing that might change the direction of food and farming?
I think the most interesting one that we're seeing at the moment, particularly with the pandemic, is the increasing emphasis on immunity, supplementing our immune systems. Now, that's been going on in the past before, but that's one of the areas that's really received a massive boost due to the pandemic. We've seen rises in Australia, UK, and US on Google, 10 times increases in searching for terms like immune and immunity. So that's one particular area which has really had a major boost. And of course, that's because we don't have a vaccine, but people are looking at how do I ensure that my immune system's as fired up as possible to resist getting infected. And I think that's a really, really interesting one. And the other side of things that I see is this increasing need for personalisation, and not only in food, but in everything that we do. I mean, the interesting one for me the other day was I did an update to my Outlook 365. I found an email. I was going to reply to that email, and it comes up with, "We think you have something you need to follow up with this person." And it showed me another email where I said I'd get back to them soon. And that's AI. That's personalising and predicting what it is that I want. And we see that in all aspects of life. You go to Netflix. Why do you think you get the list of things that might interest you? It's personalising the content for you based on what you watched before and what the algorithm thinks it is that you're going to want to watch and enjoy as much as you enjoy what you're already watching. So I think that whole personalisation trend for me is a major driver, and not just physical health, not just nutrition for health, but also cognitive health, emotional health, general mental well-being. That's now being wrapped up. I mean, wellness used to be, NIMBY term, hey man, yeah, let's get some wellness out here. But wellness has gone mainstream in the last year or two. And that's what people are looking for. They're looking for food to make them feel well, and not just physically healthy, but cognitively, emotionally, and everything else.
That's an interesting take. I just want to go back to your point around personalisation. Will that be similar to what we might see when browsing Netflix, that we'll get customised recommendations? For example, Steve, you might enjoy eating a beef burger. How do you see that working with food?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that, definitely, Steve. I mean, looking at some of the technologies that are out there right now for personalisation, one of my favourites is a company called DNANudge over in the UK, and they launched their DNA nutrition product late last year. And basically, you can buy their product, and what you get is like something about the size of a shoebox. You get a mouth swab. You take a mouth swab, you put it into the analyzer, which is probably about the size of a tea plate or less. You put that on top of the analyzer. 15 minutes later, it's analyzed your DNA, worked out nutritionally what's good for you, and you can upload that to your phone, go to a grocery store, and it'll tell you that Acme brand tomato soup isn't as good for you as XYZ brand. And that's the one that you should buy based on your DNA.
Wow, that's incredible. So would that solve problems for people with intolerances to certain foods?
Look, it could, but I mean, there is a lot of information out there already on that side of things. More what it's about is looking at nutritionally what our predispositions are. So there's another company called Day 2, and they do work on the microbiome. And you and I could get 10 people in a room, give everybody a piece of chocolate and check their blood sugar level, their glycemic index. And some people, it will go through the roof. Some people have very little effect, and other people, it'll be in the middle. Now, we all then have a piece of apple. Now, some of those people who did nothing with chocolate will go through the roof with the apple, and some of the people who went through the roof on chocolate will have no reaction to the apple. So nutritional responses to foods is individual to that extent that give everybody the same identical piece of food, they will have different reactions to that piece of food. So it's steering people away and saying to people, we go back to our app there as well from DNANudge, look, you metabolize, say, caffeine very, very slowly. So really you should be heading more towards low caffeine coffee, or you should be not eating that chocolate that's all dark chocolate or something with more caffeine. Maybe you should go for something a little bit less. So that's why it's DNANudge. They're trying to nudge people towards things which are healthier for them, better for their individual metabolism. And if you combine that with the microbiome research that's going on, that's again showing how individual our responses are to food, then that's showing you, to me, the way things are moving. And who today is surprised when someone says, I had my DNA analyzed by Ancestry.com? If you'd said that 30 years ago, I'd have looked at you like, what are you talking about? DNA analysis? You had it done? That should cost you $5 million. Well, no, I got it done for $199 on Ancestry. And Ancestry are going to go into nutrition. So they're heading towards nutrition as well. And they've got a lot of data.
I want to ask you about alternative proteins. There's been a lot of discussion around it. Mm-hmm. One product that's getting some momentum is cellular meat. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about it, how it's made, and how far away it might be?
Yeah, look, that's really interesting. And I mean, one of my most hated terms is lab-based, lab meats or lab foods, because every single food that we currently eat started out in a lab. So if you've got a new flavor of yogurt, they didn't just go out and put it into 100,000 litre or 10,000 litres or whatever. They started in a lab. They put it on the bench. All the technologists got together. The suppliers got together. They developed the product in the lab. Then they took it out, maybe did some pilot scale runs, and then scaled it up and did it. So lab-based meat, as they call it, is no more lab-based than your yogurt. Your yogurt started in a lab as well. Everything starts these days in a food lab somewhere, whether it's an ingredients company's food lab, a manufacturing company's food lab. It all starts off in a food lab somewhere. And so the stage that we're at with that cellular agriculture, as you said, cultivated meat, there's clean meat, there's all sorts of things. I'm not keen on clean meat because it's like a judgment term, but cultivated meat, cell-based meats, that's the best we've got at the moment. And what they basically do is, there are various methods. Some people are taking it from even chip of chicken feathers. Other people are taking small biopsies, but basically you take a small amount of animal cells and then you select those cells and then you grow them up in various stages. You put them in a big fermenter and you grow the meat. I mean, that's obviously a very simplistic way of looking at it. The best parallel, which is often used, is making beer. Now, when we make beer, we take yeast, we take hops, we take water, we take everything else, we put it in, we ferment it away, we then take the yeast off and keep the beer, which most people seem to think is a really good idea, keeping the beer. What we do, though, with the cell-based meat is the same thing. We put the cells in, the nutrients in, but instead of keeping the liquid, which we can recycle for the nutrients anyway, we keep the cells and we use the cells to make products. So that's a very simple way of looking at how you make cultivated meat.
So how far away before we might see it on the supermarket shelves?
Looking at a couple of big companies, big investments in the last 6 or 7 months, we've got Memphis Meats is one of the big ones in particularly the animal agriculture side of things. They're making cell-based beef products in particular, and a company called Blue Nalu who are making aquaculture products, so cell-based aquaculture. And Memphis raised 160 million, and I think it was Blue Nalu about 30 million US. So we're looking at them having pilot plants in production by the end of, say, next year. Now, that will then enable them to go, like most products do, they will probably go into maybe high-end restaurants, or they'll go into, a few restaurants around the world for proof of concept to show people. As to supermarkets, Steve, I think, 5 years would be fairly optimistic, maybe 10 years, maybe if we're talking here again, evokeAG, 2030. Then I think we might be talking about, we just tasted some or whatever, and it's not in the supermarket as such. It's readily available to the general public if they want to spend the money on the product.
Do you see this as a threat to livestock farmers, or is there room for both?
I think in the immediate future, there's room for both. Now, we're talking about having to almost double the amount of food that we need. Now, whether you look at it in calories or kilos, there's lots of ways of looking at it, but 70 to 100% more food required by 2050 to feed close to 10 billion people. I struggle to see the replacement of animal agriculture in that time frame. Just sheerly the amount of factories you would have to build. I mean, to build a factory from ground zero concept to full commercialization is years, 2 to 3 years. So even if we said, yes, we've solved it all, it'd be 2023 before we could actually start making huge amounts of product. And there we're talking $500 million to $1 billion for a good sized factory. That sounds like a lot, but it's actually not. We build abattoirs at the moment. A decent sized abattoir in Australia will be 250 million Australian dollars without any problems. A biopharma facility will cost you 2 billion. So the money's there, but it's just, getting everything in place to do that. So I don't see there being anything in that up to 2050, but how it's going to shake out when cultivated meat, the cellular agricultural products, are as cheap for some cuts, particularly the ground meat cuts, as conventional animal agriculture, that then does become a problem, because as we know, you have to sell everything on the animal. As we've seen, again with COVID-19, you go to the supermarket and there's no mince. Plenty of steaks, no mince. But you can't just sell mince, because what do you do with the steaks? You can't just take the mince off the animal and leave the rest. So that's a real problem. And I think that's where we could see some interesting tipping points in there. So I think that that's certainly going to be an issue for the conventional animal agriculture industry in the future. The thing is, if we don't do it in Australia and somebody else does, let's say Saudi Arabia decides to become the beef mince manufacturing capital of the world, and they can provide mince product cheaper out of Saudi Arabia than we can, what's going to happen to our industry? So I think we have to pursue both of these things in parallel and see what shakes out in the marketplace in the future. That if we ignore it and simply go into protectionism mode, great in the short term. In the long term, when Saudi Arabia or Nigeria decide that they're going to adopt these technologies, and we're in a global market, if we don't do it, somebody else will. Technology is highly transferable. So is money and venture capital. Somebody else will do it, and then we'll suffer.
Interesting point you make about having to sell or find a use for everything on the cow. And you use the example of mince, that you don't just grow beef cattle for a certain cut of meat. Otherwise, there'd be huge waste issues. Other than for food, animal agriculture also accounts for other non-food products. So using cattle as the example, they're responsible for other products such as leather and gelatin. So if animal agriculture didn't exist, there would need to still be some kind of substitute for those types of byproducts.
Yeah, I think that looking at that, I mean, there's a lot going on in that cellular agriculture area. And if you look at things like gelatin, we've got Geltor, who are in with Gelita, the big gelatin company at the moment. They're going to start making gelatin via synthetic biology. So they grow, they use microorganisms to grow rather than having to take that from animals. Now, again, that's been scaled up. They've got an arrangement with Gelita. So there's gelatin. So if you sort of almost, if you like, go around the animal and say, well, what else gets sold? What other byproducts there are? Basically, gelatin, of course, is one. And then you talked about leather. Now, there's a company called Modern Meadow. They've teamed up with a massive chemical company called Evonik in Europe to make synthetic leather. So, well, sorry, it's not synthetic leather. It's actual animal leather, not produced from an animal. And when it's basically put together and compressed, it basically has the same properties as animal leather. So there's another one you tick off. That's another one gone. So if you can't sell the bones and everything else for your gelatin, you can't sell the hides. We've got a company called Pivot Bio, and they're making microorganisms that will fix nitrogen and provide other nutrients to plants instead of using conventional fertilizers. So, okay, blood and bone goes away. So if you've got no blood and bone, no gelatin, no leather, then it's, that's the problem. If you don't sell those, the value of those has to go somewhere else. And on top of that, to add insult to injury, you have to dispose of those products now. You can't actually sell them anymore.
That's a great point. And it becomes a waste disposal issue too, right? So not only does it impact the return you get on the animal, but all of a sudden you've got to dispose of these parts that you can no longer sell. I can imagine that would create a few headaches in the future. Just to turn to another alternative protein, insects. I'm interested to hear your take on that. They say around 2 billion people in the world today consume insects, yet here in Australia, it's not a common part of our diet. It's still very niche. Do you think there'll be a rise in consumption of insects here in Australia anytime soon?
I think that's an interesting one, Steve. As you say, 2 million people eat insects on a regular basis. You go up to some of the markets or look at pictures of the markets in Asia, and there's, tables full of fried tarantulas and locusts and all sorts of insects that you can eat. So the problem we have over here is obviously the ick factor. Oh, an insect. When we think of insects, we reach for a can of fly spray or a can of Mortein and kill them. The only good insect is a dead insect. But I've been up to Asia, up to Thailand, and tried some, was it sesame seed silkworms and hot and spicy crickets in snack packs? Crunchy and nice. No, the legs don't get caught in your teeth either from the crickets. And there's nothing wrong with them. Now, whether people will ever really in Western industrialized countries with the sort of food cultures we have get into insects, I think there's room for it. Has there been a major driving force? Does seem unlikely in the near future. But I think the interesting one is protein and fats from insects, which can be incorporated into other products as powders or as the fat, insect fat, very high quality fat, very good. And the protein from insects is very, very good, very, very good amino acid profile. And the other one is that don't think about is why do we need the whole insect? Like, why do we need the whole animal to get the meat? Why do we need the whole insect to get the protein? Why don't we just grow insect cells and then use those? We'll just grow the insect protein, the insect fats, and that's it. We don't actually need the whole insects at all. So maybe growing insects has been superseded before it's really even started.
That's a really interesting point because I think, like you said here, it's somewhat of a cultural thing. The thought of eating an insect when you look at it, I guess, turns people off. And so crushing an insect and adding it as an additive, that's probably more appetizing. But the fact you say maybe we can just grow the cells, is that being done now? Or is that something you might see down the track when we target those particular proteins and fats and just look at growing them and adding them to the food somehow?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's people already looking at growing insect cells. One of the advantages of insect cells, you don't need the temperatures, the controls, and they're a bit more robust and easier to grow. Not easy, but easier than, say, mammalian cells. So people are looking at that already. And then, as you say, what do we need? Do we want to grow just the protein via synthetic biology, where we put the genes into a microbe and then grow them? I mean, that's another potential avenue. So there's lots of different ways things can be done. And just to go back to your point, Steve, about the look of insects, let's think of a prawn. Those big black beady eyes, the long antenna, all those legs there, and they're a weird looking creature, let's face it. And then how do you eat them? First of all, you break their body off. Then you break the tail off. Then you pull the skeleton off the outside, pull off all the legs. Sometimes you take the intestines out and sometimes you don't. Then you dip them in sauce and eat them. I mean, what's strange about that?
There's absolutely nothing wrong with eating that, and we're used to it. And I think that's to your point. We've had this cultural evasiveness to eating insects, yet we eat things that live in the ocean that resemble insects.
And you're exactly right. They have a common ancestor. They are the insects of the ocean and insects of the land. So common ancestors. So they're in the same general species, if you like, as each other.
Just going back to your point about growing specific insect cells, and we're also talking about waste, just hearing you describe eating a prawn, there's a fair bit of waste that comes from breaking it apart to eat a small bit of meat. So, Tony, could cell-based foods improve our efficiency in these areas in terms of wastage and use of resources?
Look, I think it's very definitely a possibility there. I think there's a lot of talk around at the moment about, will cell-based meat be better in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and CO2, and how do you calculate this and how do you calculate that? I think the jury's really still out on what the advantages might be in the cell-based products. My view is that they will be more efficient in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but whether that's 50%, 90%, 20%, we don't know, because we don't have a system that we can actually measure. No one's built a factory to make this stuff, so we really don't know. But I think, in my mind, what's indisputable is we use less land, and we don't need to use arable land. You can put these things anywhere. So you put the factory anywhere you like. It doesn't have to be arable land. So in terms of arable land, it's 100% less. In terms of land area, 95%, something like that. And in terms of water usage, vastly more efficient. You can recycle the water, just use what you need to use. So for me, those two things are indisputable. The other ones, the energy and the GHG emissions, there's still a little bit to be done on those. And I think that will come out in the wash in the next, say, 2 to 3 years as we see some of these pilot plants come online. And we'll see just where things actually lie. But that's looking, 2021, 2022, before we really have a good idea of what the relative efficiencies are.
Tony, I wanted to ask you about smoked salmon. There's a technology whereby smoked salmon is being created from algae. How does that work, and have you tasted it?
Yeah, there's a product called, it's from a company called Odontella, which is named after the species of microalgae that's used to make it. And it's a really interesting product. Yeah, I actually did taste that last year. I was at a conference in San Francisco with Pierre Callejo, who's one of the founder of Odontella. And the look of it, it doesn't have the muscle definition, if you like, that you see when you see a piece of salmon. But boy, I tell you what, it tasted pretty good. I was pretty impressed with that product. I mean, put that on a sandwich and give it to someone and tell them they got a smoked salmon sandwich and they didn't look, I think they would go, that's not bad, that's okay. It might not be the premier Norwegian slow smoked salmon at $200 a kilo, but it's still a decent product. And I think that's really interesting. There's so many things you can do with algae. I mean, they can make everything. I mean, people think when they eat fish, yes, they eat the fish for the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. The fish don't make them. Fish get them from algae. So if we want to cut out the middleman or the middle fish, we should get it from algae. That's where we get omega-3s and omega-6s from. And there are thousands of species of algae that do all sorts of weird and wonderful things, microalgae to macroalgae, that can produce all sorts of biochemical products and proteins, very high quality proteins again.
That's really interesting. So what are some of the other products that they're looking at creating using algae?
Well, one of the main ones they're looking at, of course, is protein. As we know, everybody's after protein, and we need protein in our diets. But there's nothing, sacred about where we currently get our protein from, which is from animals and from plants. There's nothing to say that we can't get protein from algae as well. I mean, the way things have gone, that's not what happens. But most of the world don't get much protein from algae. But there's nothing to stop us growing algae and growing other non-traditional plants to get our protein. And if you look at also what they call the algal bioeconomy, you're looking at they've been able to use algae to make things to substitute for petrochemical products as well. We're looking at extracting products from algae that have functional properties for health as well. So the algal bioeconomy is really one that over the next couple of decades, I think is going to see some massive growth because, again, we don't need arable land to grow algae. Now, what you need to grow algae is you need dry area, not much rain. You need lots of land. And if you've got proximity to seawater, that's even better because you can grow algae on seawater. So you don't need fresh water. So we've removed those two tyrannies, as I call them, of arable land and fresh water. Now, let me think of a country that has lots of coastline, lots of non-arable land, and low rainfall. Gee, can you think of anywhere like that, Steve? And what about countries that import most of their food, like in the Middle East? A lot of countries import 85 to 90, 95% of their food. They've got large amounts of non-arable land, lots of sand they can't do much with to convert to arable land, close to the sea. They don't have much fresh water. What they do make is often desalination and everything else, expensive way to make water. So these technologies are really ideal for a lot of areas of the world. And I think that's the thing. Again, we don't need arable land and we don't need fresh water. And those are the two things that are very, very much limiting on the amount of food that we can grow globally.
Another interesting emerging technology that I'd like to get your perspective on is food being created by electricity. Can you tell our listeners a little about this?
Yes, look, there's so many new technologies, Steve. I mean, I've been in the food industry for a long time, over 30 years, and there's never been a more exciting time to be in the food industry. And that's one, there's an example of a company called Solar Foods. They're a company out of Finland. And basically what they do is take solar energy and use the electricity generated to separate water molecules out into oxygen and hydrogen. They add a little bit of carbon, some other micronutrients and so on, and they grow microorganisms. And that is a biomass, again, with very, very high protein content. So that's, basically, food from electricity or food from the air, as they like to call it. And another company doing a similar thing is a company called DNANudge. Now, what people don't often know is that cement, making Portland cement, not concrete, but the cement, Portland cement powder, produces 8% of all greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 gas emissions in the world. So this company, DNANudge, they take the CO2 stream off. They then add their proprietary blend of microorganisms. They add some other micronutrients and some hydrogen into there, and they turn that into biomass. And they can do that right next to Portland cement plants. And, there's a huge Portland cement plant, one of the biggest ones in the world. I think it's Nigeria, and they're looking at putting something in there. And that's going to be, that makes a massive difference as well. So that's producing protein and biomass from the CO2 byproducts of Portland cement, which I think is a great one.
So what sort of foods would these proteins go into?
Well, if you have a look at all sorts of products that we buy are protein fortified. Whey protein is another one that's very much in demand worldwide. You'll find that in everything from sports drinks to all sorts of food products. And there are companies making that through synthetic biology as well. But protein fortification, one of the big drivers for consumers is making sure they get enough protein. Now, some of us, I think, with what we're in our diets, we're probably getting too much protein, more protein than we need. But consumers have this focus on protein. So if you have a look at these biomass products, whether it's the Nova Nutrients product or the Solar Foods product, they're producing protein. You can use that to fortify products, and depending how you process them, whether they've got any what they call functional properties, in other words, they contribute maybe to texture or mouthfeel or something as well, you can incorporate those in a wide range of products that need protein fortification.
Tony, I believe you recently tried some whiskey that was aged without using a barrel. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about this?
Yeah, that's another interesting one there, Steve. It's a company called Glyph, and that's their whiskey, as they call it. And I went over to, say, the States last year, and I tasted some of their product. And I tell you, it wasn't quite whiskey, it wasn't quite brandy, but I tell you what, it was a very, very nice drink. And what they've done there is deconstructed whiskey, looked at what flavor components are in the whiskey, and then sourced them from other got them from other sources like plant-based materials and so on, and then blended them back to make the product. So they don't need the aging, and as probably everybody realizes, when you age something in a barrel, you lose a lot every year. It needs to be topped up every year throughout the 10, 20-year life of the product. You can't just end up with a half-full barrel. So it gets rid of the aging, it gets rid of the losses. I think they call it the angel's cut or the angel's share, because it evaporates into the air. And also it means that you don't need to, in theory, you don't need to ship the whole product around the world. You could ship the base around the world and send it to Australia, get it mixed with alcohol spirits over here, and make the identical product anywhere in the world without having to physically ship air and water all around the world as well.
Well, that's something for the whiskey drinkers to look forward to. I wanted to ask you about another emerging technology in producing milk, and more specifically human milk. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes, this is an interesting one. I've had lots of reactions to this one, everything from wide-eyed stares to cringes to, oh my gosh, what are you talking about? But this is actually making human breast milk from lactating mammary glands grown in a fermenter. And so basically what they can do is take the stem cells from breast milk, grow those stem cells, get them to proliferate into small mammary glands, then get them to make the milk proteins. And they can do that with, basically, they reckon they're able to do it with any species. So they can do that with human milk, they can do that with bovine cow's milk, sheep milk, goat's milk, any mammal that makes milk. They believe they can make the milk using this process. And let's face it, when it sounds like, oh yeah, but I mean, wet nurses have been a thing for hundreds, thousands of years, where, you know, women, for whatever reason, can't or don't want to feed their own baby their own breast milk, they give it to a wet nurse. And so wet nurses have been around for a long time. This is a variation, if you like, on that. And what's got the potential to do, they're saying, is to free women from having to worry about their child not getting good nutrition. Imagine if you could go and you could buy from a shop or buy online, whatever, delivered to you, human breast milk specifically formulated to your child's DNA and microbiome, as we talked about before, and it's perfect for them, and you don't need to worry. So yes, women can go on a 3, 4, 5 day business conference or trip and not have to worry, what's happening to my kid at home? Are they getting, you know, something that's not perfect for them? I really want them to have human milk, but I can't do it. and for women who can't, for whatever reason, breastfeed.
With some of the new food technologies we've been talking about coming into play now and into the future, what do traditional food systems need to do to stay on top of emerging industries and make sure they stay relevant into the future?
Go to some of the conferences that are around. Difficult, I know, now in the days of, COVID-19 and everything else, but some of them are online. Get involved in these conferences, see what's around. Don't expect anyone who's who's a beef cattle farmer to go to a conference or see a conference and come back a vegan or a vegetarian, but at least understand what's going on in these new technologies, because like it or not, these technologies are going to have a major effect on the future of food. And without an understanding and keeping an eye on that and seeing where these things are going, then you have no way of coping with the future. You don't want to end up with the same outcome as Kodak. I mean, a Kodak moment used to be a good thing. It was a nice photograph of you and your family on holidays. Now a Kodak moment more means you just went out of business. The tales of Blockbuster and Netflix. I mean, there's so many examples. Digital music. Look at what's happened around the global industries over the last few decades. And unless you keep an eye on what's going on and you adapt your strategies and tactics, then you're going to get blindsided. And really, you do not want to get blindsided. You need to keep an eye on what's going on. And I understand that is very, very difficult for people with full-time jobs to see as part of their job spending, like I do, 2 to 3 hours a day just keeping up with these new technologies and what's going on. That is extremely difficult. But you need to find a way, say, whether it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, whether it's hiring me or putting some Google alerts on or going to some conferences or whatever, is you need to find a way to keep up with these technologies, because there are technologies coming in from outside the food industry which are driving the food industry, like we were talking about the genomics, genetic testing, the microbiome. We've got these alternative products. Where did they come from? They came from the medical industry, from growing human cells for transplants and so on. So that's come from outside the industry. We've got synthetic biology, which is really going to be a major change factor in the food industry and indeed around the world, in terms of using microbes to make specific proteins, specific things that we want, without making a whole raft of other stuff that we put up with having because, well, that's the only way to get it, is from an animal or specifically from a plant. So I think the future of food's a really, really interesting space. We're seeing the intersection of a whole range of technologies that we've talked about coming together. And then if you look at the other supporting technologies like AI, machine learning, big data, our ability to do analysis that we've never had before, that is going to drive food in a way we've never seen before.
Thanks for listening to the evokeAG podcast, which is proudly brought to you by AgriFutures. For further information, head to our website, evokeag.com, or you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Until next time, have a great day.